Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Measure Success in Continuous Testing. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You should see your GoToWebinar control panel in the upper right corner of your computer screen. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you'd prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. If you have selected mic and speakers and are having difficulty hearing, please toggle to the telephone option in the control panel and dial in. If you are experiencing any issues, please type in the details of the issue into the question section of your control panel and I will assist. You're going to have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We're going to collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording. I would now like to pass the mic over to Amir Rozenberg, Director of Product from Sauce Labs, who's going to be introing the webinar.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Nikki. Really excited to welcome everybody to this webinar about Sauce Labs continuous testing maturity benchmark. To get started, I'd like to welcome my colleagues on this webinar. Firstly, Fernando Vidal, the brains and mind behind the idea of the continuous testing benchmark. Fernando is a senior data scientist at Sauce Labs based in San Francisco. And then Phil Wells, who's agreed to be with us on this webinar. Phil is a software engineer at New York Times and a frequent speaker in many testing-oriented conferences. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to discuss a new continuous testing benchmark. We'll introduce the motivation leading to this benchmark, and then we'll move to describe the composition of the benchmark and the details. Lastly, we'll hear from Phil how he leverages these metrics in New York Times hands-on to drive alignment and improvement of the continuous testing practice. Next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. All of us are working towards the same goal, basically creating optimized, functional, and enjoyable digital experience, an experience that enables us to be successful in our respective business areas, whether you're in banking, media, retail, hospitality, and so forth. We're all motivated to accelerate our velocity to ship feature faster to the market while maintaining high quality product. We're doing so partially because the end user expectation for a great experience is increasingly demanding, but also because there are always new competitors in our vertical who believe they are better equipped to steal our customer base via a high quality experience. Bill, could you give it a click, please? This is why we're focused on finding ways to accelerate the practice of continuous testing, allowing teams to accelerate their velocity while maintaining high quality product. Next slide, please. In this context, many in the software testing space, many vendors have different versions of the maturity of the continuous testing practice. All of us mentioned moving from manual testing to test automation, shifting testing to run earlier in the cycle and more frequent, providing early feedback to developers, etc. Continuous testing is a goal that all of us are trying to achieve. Next slide, please. In reality, we all know that change, however small or large, comes with a measurement of the current state and aligning everyone around a measurable goal. As a dev or test lead, often we don't know how well we're doing and how our path to improvement are often very tactical. In fact, speaking to many customers, there are many metrics out there, some of which Phil is going to refer to, and there's even disagreement which ones actually indicate continuous testing maturity. This is what drove the interest in Sauce Labs to define the first continuous testing benchmark that will assist our customers in defining goals and actions, aligning within their respective organizations, and driving the maturity up. So we in Sauce Lab, we believe that we are uniquely positioned to give this new insight to our customer base. Basically, we have over 2 billion tests that are running to date. Nowadays, it's even more. And we've got over 2 million tests running every day in Sauce Labs from a very diverse set of customers. So we see all kinds of tests on all kinds of sites and applications happening all the time. And what makes us really uniquely positioned to offer this insight is that we are able to see which tests are passing and failing, which tests are longer, what effectively contributes to the continuous testing success in your organization. Nikki, could you proceed to the next slide, please? And if Fernando and Bill come up, please feel free to stop me. So we're very excited to introduce the continuous testing benchmark. Basically, the benchmark is made of 4 different categories, which together we provide a bottom line score, which is between 0 and 100. It's an average of all scores. And we'll go through each one of those. The first one is test quality. So naturally, what we want to drive as far as maturity is a situation where most of your tests, whether you're running a smoke test at the commit level or whether you run a nightly regression test, most of your tests will be passing. And that's when you'll get most value for your testing. So basically the test, let's say you were able to reach 90% of your tests that are passing, all the information that you're getting from the test that failed are actually features that are either in development or any regression that you introduced. So we're going to go into that area in more detail, but basically, if you get a lower score, that means that you introduce some flakiness, and that basically makes you more increasingly blind to the actual information delivered through this test. The next one is fairly obvious, test runtime. So naturally, the longer the test that you run, the more likelihood that you'll that you'll see failure in this test. And so the question becomes, that it make more sense to have a long test with multiple functions that is naturally covering more functions and more likely to fail versus a short atomic test that tests specific functionality. And if it fails, it drives you straight into the root cause. The next one is test platform coverage. And naturally, we're recommending an optimum between minimal coverage and all the coverage. So 5 platforms is what we typically recommend. And lastly, within the concurrency of our virtual machine, basically the resources that are available to you, we want to give you a score of how well you're using the resources that are available to you. I'm hearing some background noise. So is Bill or Fernando back?
Yeah, we're back. Can you hear us?
Awesome.
All right.
Yes, we can.
Thanks, Amir. You were on test concurrency, I think?
Yeah, this slide is now complete. I think we're ready to go to the next slide.
Okay, so we'll jump into the actual sliding scale for test quality. And for every one of the components, we'll have this breakdown on the left. You'll see basically the sliding scale that determines the index score for that component of the continuous testing benchmark. So for test quality, we've got the 100. To get a 100 score, you need a 90% or above, and then it slides all the way down to a 0 score if the pass rate is below 50%. And the idea behind this is that if your tests are passing at a rate of 50%, you're better off flipping a coin than running the test. So this is really an important thing to get right because it's an indicator of how well a test suite is being maintained. And on the right, we kind of see that it's a breakdown of all of our customers running tests on Sauce Labs, and you can see that this is something that a lot of our customers struggle with. Like there's a big chunk of customers that have pass rates 75% and below, and this is really a sign that it's hard to maintain a test suite, and that it's difficult to make sure that broken tests are being retired. And what we see often is that a test is broken, people get used to it, they kind of like say like, oh yeah, that test is broken, I'm going to ignore it. and it still shows up in the reports. It's still using up concurrency and running in the build maybe, but it becomes noise, right? So keeping your pass rate up is really a function of not just like making sure that your tests are not flaky, that helps, but the big driver is fixing broken tests. And if a test broke, you know, that test was made in the first place because it covered some important piece of your application's functionality. And it takes a lot of work to go back and fix broken tests, but at the very least, they should be, you know, retired and stop being run. And at best, they should, you know, should go back and fix whatever broke in them so they can continue to add value and, you know, catch whatever issue they were designed to catch. So that's test quality. And on the right, this is basically the component that drags most organizations' score down the most, as you can see there. So lots of, but about 20% of customers have that benchmark for excellence of 90% or above. And that's kind of where hopefully, you know, if you're measuring this, you can kind of shift so that we can get more organizations in that bucket of excellence on this score. Next slide. Yeah, so this slide basically goes over what I was talking about. You want to be fixing tests at a rate that's higher than the rate at which they're breaking, and quarantining tests that are flaky. And yeah, that whole point about, you know, having a high ambient level, so to speak, of test failure kind of decreases confidence in the whole process. Because if you run a build and you see like, oh yeah, 70% of the tests pass, you're like, really? And it's like, oh yeah, but that's normal. That's kind of doesn't engender confidence in the process as a whole, and it just leads to a lot of a lack of confidence and a reduction of confidence in the whole automated testing process. So really, like, you should be targeting this software release is only okay if 100% of the tests pass, right? That's like the ultimate ideal. But the reality is, lots of customers that we talk to, they're like, yeah, you know, if 95% or above or 90% or above, but any amount of expected levels of failure is kind of a sign that, you know, needs some work to be done to make sure that flakiness is rooted out of your test suite so that you can really have high confidence in your releases. And that kind of threshold of 90% or above, it's like, yeah, but which 10% of your tests are okay to fail? And that kind of, you have to do some manual review. It's like, okay, let me make sure the 10% of tests that failed were the flaky ones that I kind of half expected to fail anyway. It's much better if you say, like, the only tests that I'm running are the ones that I expect to pass. So that's kind of the ultimate goal. And 90% pass rate or above is kind of a good indicator that you're pretty much there or close to it. Next slide. So test runtime. So this is basically looking at from when the test starts to when it finishes, how long does that take? And this excludes the spin up time for the virtual machine or device that the test is running on. This is really about how long does the test take to execute. And the benchmark for excellence here to get a 100 score is 2 minutes or less. And you know, we got that sliding scale all the way down to 0 if your test takes, you know, 10, 20 minutes to run. And the idea behind this and why 2 minutes is the goal is that it encourages atomic tests that test one very specific aspect of the application's functionality and is named in a way so that when the test fails, you know exactly what broke. We tend to see that customers that chain lots of functional tests together into one long test, and then they have a very kind of vague name like login flow or something like that, and it's like a 20-minute test. You know, when that test breaks, it's hard to know exactly what went wrong right away. So that's one aspect of why having short tests is important, just for interpretability. The other aspect of it is that those shorter tests are less likely to break. And that makes sense, right? If you have this long chain of dependencies, you know, one breakage anywhere could, you know, ruin the rest of all the other things that you're checking in that test, right? So this 2-minute guideline is basically a way of enforcing atomic tests that are easily interpretable when they break, and also highly reliable. And this is another component where more of our customers are meeting that benchmark for excellence, about 33%. But still, we've got some customers that run tests that are a lot longer. There's one more benefit to having tests that are short, and that is that you can leverage parallelism better if you have short tests. Because basically, if you look at a test suite and you think about what's the fastest possible rate at which I could get a result for running this test suite, you're basically bottlenecked by the slowest test in that test suite. So if you've got lots of short tests, then you have a short build as long as you have enough concurrency. So keeping tests short is really important for a lot of reasons. So next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of visualizing that whole bottlenecking concept. You've got all these short tests, and then you got one long test that drags up the average and also bottlenecks the fastest possible rate at which the test suite can finish executing. So next slide. And then this is a really interesting analysis we did. We looked at the tests run by our customers in a 3-month period, and it was about like a couple 100 million tests. And we basically broke down the failure rates by runtime, and we found this really nice kind of stepwise function showing that if you test under 2 minutes, that's kind of like the base rate of 1, right? And tests that are between 2 and 7 minutes long fail at a 50% higher rate, and then the tests that are longer than 7 minutes fail twice as often as the tests that are under 2 minutes. So this really shows some like empirical data behind that concept of shorter tests tending to be much more reliable, easier to maintain, and less likely to fail. So this is a really important one and a really good guideline. Next slide. So test platform coverage is the next component, and this is basically measuring how many platforms you're testing on, and it's the combination of the operating system and the browser / app. So if you test on a Samsung Galaxy S7 and a native app, that's one platform. If you test on a Galaxy S7 on Chrome, that's a different platform. And so basically, this is covering how cross-platform how much you're doing cross-platform testing. And the benchmark here for excellence is to be testing on at least 5 different platforms. And 5 platforms is basically at the point where you've got a good mix of the major platforms that people are using most applications on. You've got some desktop coverage, you've got some mobile coverage, you've got maybe some real device coverage, and you've got a couple browsers on each one of those, and maybe a native app test as well if your application has a native app as well as a browser app. So 5 different platforms is kind of a good threshold for at least having some base coverage of the most popular kinds of platforms where people consume most applications. And this is something you see on the right. About 60% of our customers test on 5 or more platforms. So this is basically Soft Labs makes it kind of easy to just click a box and decide that you want to do more cross-platform testing. And this is one that our customers find it a lot easier to hit that benchmark for excellence on. So next slide. Yeah, and this is just visualizing the major combinations of platforms that we want to be testing on and the market shares. So you see having 5 platforms that you're testing on gets you to the point where you're covering everybody with a market share of 10% or more or less. So next slide. So the last component in the continuous testing benchmark is concurrency utilization, and this is all based on the size of your grid, which is essentially a proxy for your expectations of how much parallelism you expected. So when our customers decide like how much concurrency they want to use. It's a function of how big their test suites are, how many users they expect to be using the grid simultaneously, and the number of platforms they're testing on. And given all those factors, you say like, okay, we expect to, use 100 VMs or 50 VMs. And basically this measure says what percentage of what I expected to use in terms of parallelism when I planned my testing grid am I actually using. So it's essentially figuring out like, am I testing to plan in terms of parallelism? And the benchmark here is to be using 75% or more of the expected amount of parallelism. And the idea is that, this is evaluated on a 30-day rolling basis. All the components of the CTB are. So, not necessarily every single month you'll be hitting the full amount that you expected, but you should be getting pretty close to it often. So if you're hitting 75% of planned concurrent sessions being run at peak, then we think that that's the benchmark here for basically getting to where you expect it to be with your leveraging of parallelism. And this is another component where lots of our customers succeed at doing this. It's about 75% of our customers hit that 75% of their grid size in parallelism. So next slide. And this is basically a visualization of the concept of why parallelism is really important. And it shows like two theoretical builds running with different amounts of available concurrency. So you can imagine like if you've got lots of teams running builds at the same time, you might hit a bottleneck, right? So it's showing like on the left, we've got a limit of 10 sessions, and you see all those jobs, every shade of blue is basically a different test. And you see that you have to basically stack 10 tests at a time. And, the whole thing takes 30 minutes because they basically, the second 10 has to wait on the first 10 to finish. Where on the right, you've got a limit that is equal to the size of the test in that build. And basically that's illustrating that concept of, well, the longest test is 6.5 minutes long. That's how long the build is going to take. So that's like the power of parallelism and a nice visualization of why we think it's really important to make sure that you're leveraging that parallelism to the level you expected when you sized your grid or you sized your account with Sauce Labs. Next slide. So every one of those components, you stick the metric that it's based on into those sliding scales that we saw. You come out with your index score for each of those components, 0 to 100, and then we take the simple average of those, and that's the continuous testing benchmark overall score. And this is shows the breakdown of our customer base on this score, and it shows that this is definitely a benchmark that's based on best practices. It's not based on like what customers are doing out there in the wild. It's very rare for a customer to hit those benchmarks for excellence on every one of the components. Only about a little over 6% of our customer base does that, and about 20% is in pretty good shape with a score of 90 or above. But it shows that there's this continuous testing journey and the whole concept of it. We're kind of early, and our goal is that by measuring this and providing this standard benchmark, we can kind of shift that shift this distribution to the right, and help customers like identify those issues and move them into a higher score area. Next slide.
Actually, just before we do that, let's go back one slide. And so thank you very much, Fernando. This was really, really insightful. And yeah, like Fernando said, to all of our customers, we have the report available on saucelab.com. And if you're interested in learning more, if you're an existing customer and you want to learn more, how could I improve and move to the right side of this diagram? Please talk to us. We have services and guides and assistance around, improving your practice and so forth. So before we move on to Phil, who can describe how this actually works at New York Times, we wanted to turn it to you guys, to the audience, and, and give you an opportunity to let us know how applicable is this benchmark to you guys. And if it is applicable, if you could share with us, how frequently would you examine it in order to get a perspective on your continuous testing practice quality and an improvement of that? So in the next half a minute or 45 minutes, we'll let you vote, and then we'll take a look at the results. Okay, we'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, nice. So this is actually very interesting and very encouraging. So we're seeing the majority of the audience would open and review their consistent testing benchmark report between weekly and monthly. So this is very interesting. And again, if you're interested in delivery of your customized report, please let us know. We're more than happy to do so. So thank you for polling. Let's move to the next slide. Perfect. So just to summarize and recap why we're doing this. So the reason we're doing this is naturally, we're really accelerating the development of the applications. And while we're accelerating the development of the applications, we need to also accelerate the continuous testing practice in order to, deliver a delightful experience to our customer base and, bring early feedback to developer. And so to describe how these metrics and some other metrics are actually implemented in a real world example, I'd like to hand it over to Phil to describe his reality in New York Times. Phil, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Amir. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I just want to, if we can go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to kind of use the metrics that we have, sort of a jumping off point to, how these measurements, how we look to these measurements to focus the work that we do in delivering software, and a couple of the practices that we use to, improve our numbers along these axes. So, as delivery practitioners, the things that we're focused on are making sure that the software that we develop at the New York Times, speaking for, especially for the games team at the New York Times, I work on crosswords and puzzles. We want to make sure that the software that we deliver, we have confidence in it, and we want to make sure that our velocity in delivering it at a regular pace is not slowed down by, over-checking. So a couple of the practices we use to improve ourselves along these measures help us get there. Speaking to test quality, as Fernando was saying before, some people carry ambient, failure percentages around. And, I've worked with teams that has been the situation, and it kind of drives me nuts. And, I'm sure a lot of you listening, it drives you nuts too, to have, tests that are always in the red or half in the red and half not. At the New York Times, we pretty much have zero tolerance for that. Every time a new error or a new failure comes up in one of our browser tests, we open it as a production bug, and it's prioritized along with the rest of our bugs. So it gets fixed as quickly as possible. Our tests are tied to our continuous integration software. So when tests do fail, that we know immediately because it's communicated to us through our all the same reporting we have in our build features. And we have made sure that builds have to be green in order to be released. One of the ways that we're able to stay on top of it is that it's not just software engineers in tests or test practitioners who are working on the automated tests, but also web developers. Pretty much everyone on the team has the skills or is trained up to gain the skills to be able to go into the tests and write them or fix them as they become problems. We focus on continuously decomposing tests. So tests that we run in the browser to check some functionality in the browser, if we notice that some tests are longer running or that some tests are flaky, we tend to analyze those first when we're looking for tests that we can break down into unit tests or sort of mocked out component tests, integration tests. The closer we can move the quality assurance of our functionality to the left of the development lifecycle, the better. We're always looking to, kill some of our end-to-end tests because they're heavy and expensive for that reason. We introduce a lot of stability into our tests. There are a few common ways that automated browser tests fail. There are always timing issues. It's WebDriver racing against the browser and its APIs and a whole slew of systems. And, through weights and good test practices, there are ways around that. But there are also failures introduced by dependencies, so data dependencies or, user dependencies. Different users in your system under test might have different privileges. How do you clean up? How do you make sure that the data is stable before you go into a test? For test users, at New York Times, we have sort of an API where we can pull a new user from the database and use them to log in and run our tests, and then they're returned to the pool and their history is cleaned, and we never have to see that user again. So that limits a lot of our, a lot of teams. I've been on teams where we have a list of test users with a note on it that says, please do not touch these users, do not create any history with these users, and inevitably it falls apart. So an automated system to provide users is a big way that we introduce test quality and keep our numbers above 90% passing. And then for data, we also, as we break down tests from long-running browser tests, we, instead of clicking through the browser, clicking through systems to set up the data that we need to test a specific case, we tend to provide mock data through mock APIs or through local storage in the browser. One benefit of web developers working on test technology is that we're able to make the systems under test more testable that way. We give ourselves side doors to provide test data. And when we're not spending 75% of our time in a test setting up the data to assert something, when all that time goes away and we can load the page with the data we need and just get to the assertion, that leads to more stable tests and less, journey-way failures, as we were describing before. For test runtime, we try to keep our tests as atomic as possible. It all ties in with our test users and our mock data. We have set up and tear down functionalities where we try to, as closely to the assertion as possible, we try to provide the data that we need, load the application in the state that we need it to be in to test, and then run the test and get out of there, which means that we have very few long-running tests, but we have very many short-running tests, and that's the way we like it. The tests are able to run very quickly that way, much more quickly than a long-running, holistic, as Fernando was explaining. This is the login pass test, and it does everything. We hate tests like that. If we do find long-running tests in our history, we sort by the longest-running tests, and we pick those to pull apart and decompose, right? We either turn them into shorter atomic end-to-end tests, or we see if the functionality covered by those tests can be covered just the same in a combination of unit tests, component tests, and integration tests. And, Sauce Labs is great for that because they have great analytics around our test history. We're able to go in and pinpoint which of our tests are very fast and which of our tests are not so fast, and we can set our sights on them. We try, trying to keep up a high velocity in our development lifecycle leads to developers finding ways to optimize for this. If a developer thinks their feature is done, they push the application to a testing environment, and if it takes days to get test results back, that's a bummer, right? No developer wants that. We want to get results in minutes, and we want to see if our changes broke something unexpected fast so that we can address it right away and not have to do further, rework down the road. We're trying to limit rework at all times. Another thing that we've noticed in limiting test runtime is some of our tests make heavy calls, heavy WebDriver calls. So in particular, when we test the crossword for the New York Times, we have to test every little cell in the crossword grid, and WebDriver at one point was asking the browser to return those web elements to us, cell by cell, letter by letter. And it was taking forever because, you know, those WebDriver calls go over HTTP traffic. It takes a long time. So rather than do that, we've found places where we do that, or multiple calls similar to that. We'll just grab all the HTML for the crossword grid or for any complex element like that. Just grab that as a web element and then break that down into a DOM in code rather than making all those DOM calls in the browser. We use a library called Cheerio to transform HTML that we get from WebDriver back into a virtual DOM, but there are plenty of libraries that do this, and it speeds up our certain tests many, many times over, particularly when we're working through a tunnel for security and trying to connect from New York to the West Coast servers for Sauce Labs. We've seen tests that were taking 200 seconds to run go down to taking 20 seconds to run. So that's been a big win for us, is limiting the number of WebDriver calls that certain tests make. And then moving on to test platform coverage, you know, the New York Times supports a lot of different platforms. In the games team alone, we release not only standalone games for the web, we also have applications for Android and iPhone. And not to mention, the New York Times core application is a hybrid app that serves our web applications in a web view. So between desktop web, mobile native, and mobile hybrid apps, we have a lot of demand for variety across different platforms. And, you know, of course, Sauce Labs makes it easy. That's their main offer, right? They offer all these different platforms and just make it simple to spin up whatever configuration is popular among our users. But that said, not all of our tests need to run across all these different platforms. You know, we try to target as well as we can if there are purely game logic or business logic tests that for some reason couldn't be tested at the unit test level and have to be tested in a browser. That might not necessarily require as many different browser platform combinations as, say, our visual diff tests do. Visual diff, you would want to run that across as many platform browser combinations as you can, because that's what breaks across different browsers and platforms. And so we're continually checking our tests and making sure that the logic lines up and that we're testing things across the right platforms. That said, if you do, it was important to us we knew going into our automation project that we were going to need to test across many platforms. And so we implemented the ability to do that early. I've seen a lot of teams, pop up their test suite just testing on Chrome on the desktop or whatever until they have hundreds of tests, and then they open a ticket to, cross-platformize their tests, and it's a huge lift. Whereas if you knew going into it that you were going to do that and you ran every test from the inception across all the platforms you think you would need to support, it's less of a lift. It makes each discrete test a little more work to pull off, but that's it's better than stopping the presses, as it were, and doing that all at once and getting stuck and getting mired in a project like that. Implement cross-platform coverage early would be my advice. And then finally, test concurrency. We run many tests in parallel, particularly when we're doing continuous integration. When we're developing tests locally, we'll test in one test at a time, but we want these tests to run fast. And a big part of that mission is solved by running tests concurrently. We happen to run, we're testing all these different platforms, and so that's how we parallelize our tests. We run, Chrome, Firefox, and Safari might be three platform configurations for our test suite, and we'll have those all running at the same time, just running down our list of tests. That's one way to do it, and it's by no means the only way to do it, but that's how we've found success. And there are a few gotchas when you're testing concurrently. And one thing that teams have run into is user management, again, becomes important, particularly for something where you're creating history for users, like a game, or like, there are countless kinds of applications where users create history. If you're logged in as, Phil Wells at NY Times across 3 different browsers running different tests, they might be creating history that has cross purposes, and history from one user might be polluting the results for another test. And so to avoid that, we make sure that when a user is plucked out of the user pool for a test, it's locked and can't be plucked out by another test. So each test has a unique user running at any given time, and that user's history is cleaned after the test is completed. Logging and reporting can also get pretty confusing if you're running a bunch of tests from one process. And this is another thing that Sauce Labs has been a huge benefit to us. When you run tests, massively parallel tests in Sauce Labs, they just automatically parse all the outputs, the pass, fail, and all the logs on a by test level, and you're able to search through the history. It's all well categorized for you, and it's been a huge benefit for us having Sauce Labs while we're running our tests in parallel. And I just want to say that testing concurrently is another practice that you are going to want to implement early. If you are, if you have a huge test suite and then suddenly you want to implement concurrent testing, you're going to run into some of these gotchas, and it will be a headache to get them out of the way. So if you're just trying to get from manual testing to an automated testing practice, now is the right time to think about not only testing across many different platforms and implementing that initially, but also testing your tests concurrently and implementing that at the beginning too. And so, that's, I'm through my notes. That's, I think I've touched on all 4, and that's basically how the New York Times has been able to meet these metrics and ensure that they're aligning with our goals of making sure our developers are delivering code confidently and at a high pace.
Well, thanks, Phil. This is Bill McGee from Sauce Labs, and I really appreciate the insight as well as the presentations from Amir and Fernando. We're going to open it up to Q&A, and Phil, I think we have one for you straight off, and this is from Tommy. He asks, what was the library you used to convert HTML to virtual DOM?
So we were using Cheerio.js. So our WebDriver solution is WebDriver IO, which is a JavaScript solution. And there's an HTML parsing library called Cheerio, where you can pass in HTML as a string, and it'll convert it into a DOM in basically just in a variable in JavaScript. And then you're able to crawl that DOM using, it's sort of like jQuery. You can just parse the DOM in memory using jQuery, and it's very, very fast.
Excellent, thank you. Fernando, we were getting asked, is the phrase test failure or test pass referring to the pass-fail of the automation or the pass-fail of the actual test? There is a difference.
Yeah, so this is a good question. Basically, when we say pass rate or failure rate, we're talking about whatever the intended behavior of the application was in that test. It has nothing to do with whether the test itself had some kind of connectivity error or some kind of other error that caused the actual test to not do what it was intended to do. These are all tests that successfully completed, but the test itself reported back that the application did not meet the expected behavior.
Great, thank you. This just in from Laura. When you talk about test platform coverage, is it the general approach to run all tests on all tested platforms, or are the additional platforms typically tested with more targeted subsets of the test suite?
So this, I think, when we look at the data, there's different customers do different things with this. Lots of customers we see, because we notice the test names include the name of the platform. That's pretty common. while other customers just have, one test name and they just run that same name against different platforms. So different customers do different things along these lines, and it kind of depends on what they're going for. Like a native app test is definitely going to be very different than a browser test. But we see a lot of mixing of behavior in our customer base with regards to this.
Okay, thank you. I'll throw this question to the group. What is the best way to optimize for efficiency when working with a limited budget for VM concurrency?
Yeah, so when you're limited on concurrency, particularly when you have different users competing, like within the same organization, different users competing for allocation. One way we've seen customers deal with this is to have kind of windows of time where different teams are allowed to use the capacity. That's not optimal, but obviously, if you are bottlenecked by concurrency, figuring out like schedules for being able to use concurrency is one thing you could do. But yeah, it's definitely much better to talk about upgrading the amount of concurrency that you have, because you don't want to. The whole idea behind continuous testing, it's not on a schedule, right? It's whenever people are writing code, that's when the testing needs to get done. But having short tests is another good way of helping with this. If you have long tests, they're going to bottleneck capacity longer. So if tests are short, then you can get them in and out of the capacity faster, and it can help, when you're struggling with a limited concurrency.
That's great.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that a little bit more. So Fernando has it exactly right. So I think that when you think about your available resources, there are these massive regression tests that are pretty much predictable, in terms of their utilization and how long it takes to execute them. And there's some level of predictability there. So you know that test is going to, if you gave it 10 or 50 VMs, it will run for an hour or so. And if you are able to sort of stagger your teams across the day in executing those tests, then effectively what you could do, and this is something that Sauce Labs has as a unique proposition, not only we're offering team level allocation of resources, but that team level allocation is actually available via REST API. So let's say you're using a CI server such as Jenkins. What you actually could do is, when the time comes to run this regression test, you could actually switch resources around for this regression test, give them almost the entire capacity or close to it, so that regression test basically executes as fast as possible and finishes, and you move to the next team. And customers who have been doing so have seen almost no throttling, no queuing, and a lot of tests were successfully executed.
Excellent, thank you. Here's one that I think could basically form a webinar in and of itself. But the question is, nowadays, most of the firms target creating automation test suites even when the application requirements are not solid. Is this the right way? Is it really possible? That's kind of a broad question, but I think we talk about the fact that it really does have to be a partnership between dev and automation engineers. But Amir, Fernando, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're seeing increasingly is, whether you're using BDD or whether developers are starting to create tests in various developer-oriented frameworks, we're seeing more and more testing happening within the sprint, oriented towards the specific features that are destined to be delivered in this sprint. Even if you're talking about Kanban, or you're talking about weekly Scrum and things of that nature. And so I think it's actually an interesting point where increasingly features are developed gradually and are actually introduced to end users, not in completion, but rather gradually. And people are looking, product managers, for example, are looking at features and making sort of, midway milestones to see what's the right direction, to see what's the adoption and things of that nature. And so in some respects, testing is very, very similar. Testing has to be agile. And even though maybe the global requirements are not completely set in stone, testing has to be developed in order to enable developers to get fast feedback about defects that they're introducing within that sprint, ideally within 10 minutes. And so that's actually a very common phenomena in advanced organizations.
If I could chip in, I think a mindset shift is you need to be able, when you're writing new automation and coding new automated tests, you need to have the mindset that this is a test that you wouldn't mind deleting someday. So if it's testing functionality that's just getting you across the finish line for this sprint, but you know that it's going to shift or the final delivered product is not going to match the requirements for this test, it's fine. As long as it's helping the development team be confident and keep their pace going and keeping the code in check while they develop elsewhere, then it's beneficial and it's worth your time, first writing it and then unwriting it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, I think we're almost at the top of the hour, or the bottom of the hour, so I wanted to thank everyone again, Phil, Amir, Fernando, for participating today and sharing your insights. We will be sending out a recording as well as a link to the report itself, so anyone who has signed up for the webinar will be able to download the report. If you are a Sauce Labs customer, as Amir mentioned at the outset, we would be happy to run a report specifically for your team or organization, and you'll just need to get a hold of your account rep or your customer success manager in order to do that. So with that, we will go ahead and close out today's session. Thanks once again to everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.